Alright, we are on lesson 11, our objective. Be sure you fill it in. I will be able to multiply and divide real numbers using properties of multiplication and division in the tic-tac-toe number chart. I will show you the tic-tac-toe number chart in just a minute, but first we need to just do a quick review of what we already know about multiplication. What we remember about multiplication is that it is basically just repeated addition. 2 plus 2 plus 2, that gives me 6. That's the same thing as 3 times 2, okay? 3 plus 3, that gives me 6. That's the same thing as 3 times 2. It's 3 2 times, right? This is 2 3 times. You know that, all right? Now, multiplying signed numbers. What you need to know is that the product of two numbers with the same sign is a positive number. 3 times 4 is 12. Negative 5 times negative 3, a negative times a negative gives me a positive. The product of two numbers with opposite signs is a negative. A negative times a positive gives me a negative. A positive times a negative gives me a negative. So basically, if they have the same sign and you multiply them, you get a positive. If they have different signs and you multiply them, you get a negative. An easy way to remember this, if you forget, you can always draw a tic-tac-toe board, just like you were going to play tic-tac-toe, and then you put plus signs right across the diagonals. And then everywhere else, you put negative signs. Okay, this is something to help you remember. If you can't remember, well, what is a positive times a negative? Well, I know I can always draw my tic-tac-toe board, okay? And then what you will see is that a positive times a negative gives me a negative. A negative times a positive gives me a negative. And then a negative times a negative gives me a positive. That's basically the lesson for the day. If you can draw a tic-tac-toe board, put pluses across the diagonal, and then negatives everywhere else, you know how to do it. So let's work it out. It says, we're not going to worry about justifying for this part. 4 times a negative 8. Actually, let's do justify for this one. I lied. Let's justify. 4 times negative 8. So all you got to do is multiply those two. 4 times 8 gives me 32. If you need to use this number sign right here, we see that we've got a positive times a negative. So a positive times a negative gives me a negative. So this should be a negative 32. Box it in. It says to justify my answer. So a positive, be sure you write this down. A positive, I'll let you use this number sign, number times a negative number equals a negative. Oops, am I getting this in here? Negative number. So a positive number times a negative number is always going to give me a negative number. Alright, same thing here. I've got a negative times a negative. If I need to use my tic-tac-toe board, negative times a negative gives me a positive. So I've got 6 times 7 tenths. That should give me 4 and 2 tenths. So I've got a positive 4 and 2 tenths. So I could just write a positive, I'm getting this in here, a positive times I've got positive. A negative times a negative gives me a positive. So a negative times a negative equals a positive. So everything we've done so far is dealing with multiplication. Positive times a negative gives me a negative. Negative times positive gives me a negative. Negative times a negative gives me a positive. It's the exact same thing with division. This chart right here works for multiplication and division. If you've got a positive divided by a positive, that gives you a positive, or excuse me, yeah, you already knew that. And then if you've got a negative divided by a negative, that gives you a positive. Negative divided by a negative gives you a positive. So same thing here. If you're dividing two numbers that have the same sign, your answer is always going to be a positive. If you are dividing two numbers that have opposite signs, your answer is always going to be a negative. Or you can use this chart right here. Same thing. So, here we go. I've got a negative divided by a negative. I go back to my chart. I see that a negative divided by a negative gives me a positive. So I know 16 divided by negative 2 is going to give me a positive 8. We're not going to justify on this one. We justified on the last one. Same thing here. I know I've got a positive divided by a negative. Let's check. Positive divided by a negative gives me a negative. The signs are different, so we know our sign is going to be negative. And then 2 and 8 tenths divided by 7 gives me 0 and 4 tenths. All right, if you need to divide that out, negative 7 into 2 8 tenths, it gives you a 4 tenths. Just like that. So, positive divided by a negative gives me a negative. Last thing we're going to look at is exponent, raising a negative number to a power. So what I've got here is I've got negative 3 to the 4th power. So all that means is that you multiply negative 3 by itself 4 times. So negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3. We just do our multiplication from the left to the right. A negative times a negative gives me a positive. Again, if you need to flip back here to make sure that's right, negative times negative gives you a positive. There's a positive 9. Bring down everything else. Positive 9 times negative 3 times negative 3. I've got a positive 9 times a negative 3. That gives me a negative 27 times a negative 3. I brought down everything else. I'm only doing one operation at a time. Negative 27 times negative 3. A negative times a negative gives me a positive 81. Okay? Now, let's look at this next one. It's the same sort of thing, only I've got negative 3 multiplied by itself 3 times. Negative 3 times negative 3. Negative times negative gives me a positive 9 times negative 3. Positive times a negative gives me a negative 27. Now what you'll notice here is that when you take a negative number and raise it to an even power, you're always going to have a positive answer. When you take a negative number and raise it to an odd power, you're going to have a negative answer. Okay? So that's one thing to notice. The main thing for the lesson. As long as you've got this, as long as you can draw a tic-tac-toe board, put positives on the diagonal, negatives everywhere else, you've got it. Positive times a negative gives me a negative. Negative times positive gives me a negative. Negative times negative gives me a positive. That's with multiplication and division. That's all for that lesson.